Scott finally meets his future dad. About Friday night, is it really a family night on Friday or do you think you would like to go to that party with me? Family night was a total lie. So is that a yes, you'll go? Definitely yes, said Allison as she turned around to get in her car when she saw a familiar man walking towards the clinic. Hey Orion, said Allison as she called out to the white-haired man. Hey, Allison, right? Orion asked, acting confused. Yes, what are you doing here? She asked. Well, I'm actually here to see his boss, Orion said as he pointed at Scott before he continued, he is a friend of mine. I see you came to treat your dog. No, it's not mine, I accidentally hit her so I came to get it treated, she said. Orion nodded before telling Allison goodnight and watched her leave before turning to look at Scott who looked at him as if he was a competition. Don't worry, I'm not into girls her age, you can keep her, said Orion before walking into the clinic. My boss is not around, you can leave your message and I will pass it to him, said Scott. Orion took and sit and shook his head. Actually I am here for you, your boss Deaton is currently running an errand for me, so he will be invalid for a while so that leaves you and me, said Orion. Scott frowned as he sensed something was wrong. Who are you? He asked. Well, I go by many names over the years but you can call me Dad now or whenever you are comfortable but that's not why I am here, said Orion while smiling as he saw the confusion in Scott's eyes. Friday night is your first full moon and you are going to turn for the first time, are you sure you still want to go to that party? Scott's eyes widened when he heard that. I don't know what you are talking about, and why should I call you Dad, my father? Said Scott but Orion cut him before he could complete his sentence. I know, but your mother and I are two fated people, so there is a 100% chance that she and I are going to, Orion said as he brought his two hands together and made a love sign with them. So that's why I said you could call me Dad, and as for denial about what I said that is going to happen on Friday night, I think you know better than to continue living in denial. You are a werewolf, Scott, and not just any werewolf, you are like a progenitor of a werewolf, which means you are far stronger than anything within common sense about werewolves, but if you are not careful on your first full moon, and when you turn into the wolf, there is no coming back. That's why I am here. I helped Styles evade his fate of being a bloodsucker. I can help you too, all you have to do is trust me. How can I trust you? You made me into this, you turned me against my will and you expect me to trust you, said Scott as he got a panic attack. Seeing this, Orion sighed as his eyes turned a bright crimson red and let out a low growl making Styles calm down. I made you what you were because your fate was already sealed to become a werewolf, I just made you a better one, said Orion. What do you mean by my fate was sealed to become a werewolf? I never asked of any of these, I just want a normal life, is that too difficult to ask? Scott said. Believe me, you will come to love it. The perks of being a werewolf is a very awesome things and you being a pure blood even makes it incredible. You just need to overcome your first full moon and you will have an easy time learning control, said Orion before he sighed. Honestly, you are the only who I had to convince this much just to accept who you are now. Even Styles did not need any convincing and he just accepted who he is. You are really something else, said Orion. Scott just sighed and decided to give this werewolf thing a try and decided to talk about something else. You said something about you and my mother, I did not quite catch that, said Orion. Orion smiled as he saw the look Scott was giving him and it clearly means, don't you dare mess with my mother. Look, you should relax, your mother and I have this connection that draws us together. It is called the mate bond and it is an unbreakable bond that binds us together and nothing can break that bond and as long as I am alive, even death cannot separate us, so just give up any stupid idea you have to separate us, said Orion before he walked out of the clinic. Scott just stood there like a statue as he digested what Orion just told him. The next day. Wait, you mean he came to visit you last night at the clinic? Yes, and it seems Allison also knows him and they seem friendly, but that's not even the worst thing. You mean there is more? Yes, apparently, he and my mother have this thing that connects them together. You mean a mate bond? Yeah, how did you know about that? Well, I was doing my research yesterday when I happened to come across the subject, mate bond, said Styles as he looked around them to see if there is anyone listening to their conversation and saw that there was nobody. Then he continued, it says that, a mate bond is like what humans calls a soulmate but the mate bond is stronger as it draws the ones fated for each other closer where sometimes, they could even dream about their half and your mother has a mate bond with him. God, this is crazy. Scott frowned when he heard what Styles said. Well, at least I got to know what I am, said Scott. You mean a werewolf? Styles said. How do you know that? Said Scott. Simple, he said you should be careful under the full moon and from research, there is only one supernatural creature associated with the moon and that is the werewolves, said Styles with a smug look. If you have spent your time doing research just like me instead of daydreaming about Allison, you would have known that by now. And speaking of Allison, don't you think you two have a very strong connection like a mate bond or something? 11 comments 0 vote. Stubborn Scott. Scott, Style, you both made first line, said Coach Finstock as he looked at the new stars on the team with a smile. I got to hand it out you two. You guys are beat my expectations for you and that's a lot coming from me, so don't mess it up for me, next week or I will have you known why I am the coach. With that he left the two duo who were all smiles. Did you hear that, Scott? We are making first line, said Styles excitedly. I know, said Scott absent-mindedly. Styles turned to look at where Scott was looking inside when he saw Allison waving at Scott and besides her is Lydia. Speaking of Allison, do you think she could maybe put in a good word for me to Lydia? Styles asked Scott. I don't know, but you know she is a thing with Jackson and he is the team captain, she won't settle for less, said Scott. Styles almost laughed when he heard that. Scott, you still don't know what we are, do you? We are no lesser men, I am a vampire and you are a werewolf, we are stronger, faster than him, I highly doubt she will still have a thing for him after she sees what we can do. Styles said as he looked at Lydia, he knows Lydia very well, like the back of his hands. He knew that she is bound for greatness and Jackson is just a hindrance in her path to greatness, sooner than later they are going to have a falling out. Are you going to use your powers for your advantage? Scott asked him. Styles smirked as he looked at his lacrosse stick. I'll say it is too late to be talking about that now, don't you think? Scott sighed as he knew what Styles meant. I guess you are right, said Scott. So when are you going to tell her about tonight? I don't know, hopefully never. What? Are you planning on going to the party despite what Orion said? That's the plan and he does not have to know about it, I know I can be able to keep it in check. Are you insane? Can you even hear yourself right now? You are thinking of controlling something you have never experienced before, do you know how dangerous that is? Said Styles. It can't be that dangerous and look at you, you are perfect control of yourself, so I believe it won't be that hard to control, said Scott. Styles just sighed as he looked at Allison and wondered if he could convince her to change her mind about tonight. As if knowing what he was thinking, Scott looked at his best friend, and you will not say anything to either Allison or Orion, do you hear me? Scott said as he looked into the eyes of Styles. I can't promise that, I will have to tell either one of them or maybe both, said Styles as he smirked at Scott. Scott didn't like that joke as his eyes turned golden yellow and he tightened his hold on Styles, injuring him in the process with his claws that grew from his fingers unknowingly. Styles winced in pain when Scott's claws dug into him. You see that, you can't even control yourself right now and you think you can when the moon is up in the sky. That's just your wishful thinking, said Styles as he released himself from Scott's grasp and walked away. I'm sorry, Scott said, but it was already too late as Styles has disappeared the moment he was out of sight. Hey, I'll see you tonight, right? Scott turned to see Allison behind him, smiling at him, making it very hard for him to say no to her. Yeah, sure, said Scott without even knowing. Okay, then, said Allison as she walked away, following Lydia who was on her way to talk to Jackson. Scott just sighed and hoped everything works out for the best tonight. Later that day. What do you think you are doing, young man? Getting dressed, Mom, and I am going to need the car. I have to pick up Allison at her house, said Scott as he put his shirt on. Melissa raised a brow at her son, not expecting him to say that. You are not going to any party, young man. You are going to the Beacon Hills Reserve where Orion is waiting for you to help you get through your first full moon. So call Allison right now and tell her tonight has been cancelled, said Melissa as she handed Scott his phone. Scott was surprised that his mother also knew about it. He looked at her and the phone back and forth before he took the phone from her. I will call her later, said Scott as he dropped his phone on the bed. But first of all, how did you know about me? Of course I would know about that, it was my mate who bit you in the first place, said Melissa. And you are okay with that? He ruined my life, I can't even go out with a girl I like because of the full moon, because you are afraid I might turn into a monster. All of these was his fault and not mine, so I will not listen to whatever he tells me. This was never his fault. If you want to blame someone, then blame fate. He just helped you to be something more and that's because you shared a connection to me. That's because you were my son. If it was up to him, he would have just bitten Styles and be done with it, but you will just be a regular werewolf and not anything special, so if anything, you should be thankful to him for changing your fate, said Melissa as she turned around to leave in anger. Scott just sighed as he sat back in his bed while holding his head. I guess I will just have to go get her without the car then. 27 comments 0 vote. Scott's transformation 1. You have to go stop Scott from going to that party. You are the only one whom he would listen to, said Styles to Allison, whom he went to meet despite the warning he got from Scott not to do explicitly that. And why should I do that? He asked me to the party and I accepted, so I can't change his mind right now, said Allison, not understanding Styles right now. Styles frowned, frustration evident in his expression. Allison, you don't know how dangerous things could turn out to be, especially with the kind of crowd that's expected to attend tonight. Scott's not thinking clearly, and it is my responsibility as his best friend to make sure he does not do anything that he would regret later on. Disappointed by Allison's response, Styles turned to leave, feeling a mix of worry and urgency gnawing at him. He knew he had to come up with another plan to keep Scott safe, even if it meant going against his friend's wishes. Allison just stood there, speechless, watching Styles disappear into the distance. Her mind was racing with conflicting thoughts about whether she should call the whole thing off with Scott. Before she could come to a decision, she saw Scott running up to her. Scott, why didn't you take the car? And what about Styles? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Scott, slightly out of breath, brushed off her worries. Don't worry about Styles. He's just being overly cautious. Tonight's going to be fine. Let's just focus on having a good time, okay? Allison hesitated, sensing the tension but deciding to trust Scott's reassurance for now. All right, if you say so. But please, promise me you'll be careful. Scott smiled, trying to ease her worries. I promise. Now let's get going. Orion stood in the shadows, his sharp eyes following the exchange between Scott and Allison. He shook his head, a mixture of frustration and amusement flickering across his features. He knew things were going to turn out this way. Scott is one hell of a stubborn fellow and it will make things go haywire for him to listen to reasons. As he turned to leave, he noticed Christopher Argent and the rest of the Argent hunters rushing into their cars, their movements swift and coordinated. The sight made him pause. He smirked as he remembered what might happen tonight. Orion's mind raced. Should he intervene and alter the familiar course of events, or should he let things unfold as they had before? But he quickly shook that thought out of his head as he could not just let things play out. If it was Peter who had bit Scott and not him, he would have just forego about Scott, but he could not do that because he bit Scott, and due to that reason, Scott was vastly different and much stronger than he was ever in the series, and that could lead to catastrophic effects if he did nothing to help Scott. With that in mind, Orion headed in the direction of Lydia's home where the party was being held. As he arrived at Lydia's house, the party was already in full swing. Music blared from the speakers, and teenagers crowded every room, dancing, talking, and enjoying the night. Lydia Martin, the host, effortlessly navigated through her guests, her charisma and charm on full display. Scott and Allison entered the party, trying to blend in despite the tension in the air. Scott, newly bitten and struggling with his heightened senses and emotions, was trying his best to act normal. Allison, unaware of Scott's new reality, stayed close, sensing his unease but unsure of its cause. Styles arrived soon after, keeping a close eye on Scott. He knew his best friend was still adjusting to his new werewolf abilities and was determined to help him through it, even if Scott was reluctant to accept his help. Scott's senses started to become overwhelming. The noise, the smells, the emotions, all intensified under the full moon's influence. He began to feel the pull of his werewolf side, struggling to maintain control. Scott's attention was drawn to Jackson Whitmore, who had been watching him with suspicion all night. Jackson's jealousy and curiosity about Scott's sudden transformation from an awkward teenager to a more confident and athletic version of himself added to Scott's stress. The tension reached its peak when Scott, feeling the onset of his transformation, rushed out of the house to get some air. Allison followed him, concerned for his well-being. Outside, Scott's eyes began to glow, and he struggled to suppress the change. Scott, feeling the uncontrollable pull of his transformation, bolted from the house. His eyes glowed a vivid yellow, betraying his struggle to maintain his humanity. Allison, deeply worried and confused, called after him, but he didn't slow down. Scott sprinted into the nearby woods, his heightened senses making every sound and smell overwhelming. His breathing was ragged as he tried to focus, desperate to regain control before something catastrophic happened. He could hear the distant echoes of the party, mingled with the sounds of the forest, but they only heightened his sense of panic. Styles, having noticed Scott's abrupt exit, quickly followed. Scott! Scott, wait up! He yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. Styles' urgency pushed him to run faster, knowing he had to reach his friend before the worst occurred. Back at the party, Allison stood at the edge of the woods, torn between going after Scott and staying put. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced back at the house, where Lydia and Jackson were oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. Meanwhile, Orion, who had been observing from a distance, decided it was time to intervene. He moved swiftly and silently through the woods, his own supernatural abilities allowing him to track Scott with ease. He caught up to Styles first, placing a hand on his shoulder to stop him. Orion! Styles gasped, surprised to see him. Thank God you are here, you have to get to Scott before he transforms. And I will do just that, Orion said urgently. But right now, you have to get back to Allison and make sure she gets home safely. A.N. Good news, I'm back to updating my fanfics once again, but I won't be updating it frequently. I will be able to only upload at most 2 chapters per week. Thank you for your patience with me, and also check out my novels and my other fics. More importantly, I just dropped a new FIC based on The Flash, you are going to love it. 20 comments 0 vote. Scott's transformation 2. Styles hesitated, torn between his desire to help Scott and Orion's instructions. But he knew he had to trust Orion. Okay, but please hurry, he said before turning back towards the party. As he reached the edge of the woods, he saw Allison standing there, still worried and confused. But before he could call out to her, he noticed Derek Hale approaching her. Derek, with his usual mysterious demeanor, was already talking to Allison, offering her a ride home. Styles watched from a distance, his frustration mounting. Shit, he muttered under his breath. He knew Derek's involvement meant things were more complicated than he'd thought. Meanwhile, deeper in the woods, Scott was on his knees, clutching his head as the pain of transformation racked his body. His screams echoed through the trees, a mix of agony and fear. Orion knelt beside him, his voice calm and steady. Scott, don't fight it, Orion urged. You have to let it in. The more you resist, the worse it will be. Scott's eyes, glowing golden yellow, flickered with desperation. I can't control it, he gasped. Yes, you can, Orion insisted. Listen to me. Feel the change. Embrace it. You are stronger than this. Scott's body trembled violently as the transformation took hold. His muscles bulged, bones reshaping beneath his skin. Black fur began to sprout all over his body, thick and unique, shimmering slightly under the moonlight. His face elongated into a powerful, lupine snout, and his ears became pointed and keen. His hands transformed into large, clawed paws, yet retained a semblance of their human dexterity. Scott's eyes remained a vivid, golden yellow, piercing through the darkness of the woods. He let out a guttural growl, the last vestige of his human voice merging with the primal power of the wolf. Standing on 2 legs, he had become a fearsome bipedal wolf, towering and powerful, yet distinctly Scott. Orion watched as the transformation completed. The young werewolf's features were now that of a majestic yet terrifying black wolf, exuding a raw, untamed power. But Scott's eyes, though glowing, were filled with determination rather than fear. That's it, Orion said encouragingly. You're doing great. Remember, you control the wolf. It doesn't control you. Scott's breathing steadied, and he managed to nod. The transformation complete, he felt the primal energy coursing through his body. He stood tall and, embracing the power within, let out a terrifying, earth-shaking roar. The sound echoed through the woods, sending chills down the spine of every supernatural creature in Beacon Hills. The roar was primal and powerful, filled with an unmistakable dominance that marked Scott as a force to be reckoned with. Back at the party, even Derek paused, his keen ears picking up the sound. Allison looked around in confusion, not understanding the significance but feeling the unease. Every supernatural creature in Beacon Hills felt it, except for Orion and Styles, who understood its source. Orion nodded, a proud smile on his face. You did it, Scott. You controlled the wolf in you. Scott's breathing gradually returned to normal, and as he began to calm down, the black fur receded, his bones and muscles reshaped back into their human form. Within moments, Scott was back to his human self, his clothes torn but otherwise intact. He looked at Orion, still catching his breath, but with a newfound clarity in his eyes. Styles, using his vampire speed, zoomed through the woods, arriving just as Scott completed his transformation back to human form. He skidded to a halt beside them, his face flushed with urgency. Scott. Allison is safe. Derek took her home, Styles panted, his eyes darting between his best friend and Orion. Scott's face contorted with a mix of anger and worry at the mention of Derek taking Allison home. Derek. That guy from the woods. Why would he take her home? His voice was rising, panic seeping in. Scott, calm down, Styles said, trying to soothe his friend. He didn't seem like he was going to hurt her. He was just there. Look, we'll figure this out. But Scott wasn't listening. The thought of Allison with Derek, a mysterious figure he didn't trust, was too much for him. Without another word, he took off running towards Allison's house, his speed enhanced by his werewolf abilities. Scott, wait. Styles yelled, but it was no use. Scott was already disappearing into the darkness. Styles turned to Orion, a look of desperation on his face. We have to go after him. Orion sighed, shaking his head slightly. That boy never listens. He placed a hand on Styles' shoulder. Let's go. We need to make sure he doesn't do something he'll regret. They both sprinted after Scott, Orion's supernatural agility allowing him to keep pace easily. Styles, using his vampire speed, was able to keep up as well, though the worry for his friend and the situation gnawed at him. As they ran, Orion glanced at Styles. We need to talk to Scott about managing his emotions. His reactions are too impulsive, especially with the changes he's going through. Styles nodded, his face set with determination. I know. But right now, we just need to get to him before he does something rash. As Scott sprinted through the woods, his senses heightened, he suddenly paused and sniffed the air, catching a new scent. His head whipped around, and without a second thought, he changed direction, veering off the path that led directly to Allison's house. Styles, in hot pursuit, skidded to a halt, bewildered. Why did he change direction? He muttered to himself. Orion, keeping pace effortlessly, shook his head knowingly. He's following a scent. Likely someone or something he thinks is a threat to Allison. Styles' eyes widened with a mix of concern and determination. We need to catch up with him. Who knows what he's chasing? Orion placed a firm hand on Styles' shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. This is where I part ways, Styles. Scott is looking out for the girl he likes. It's time for me to look out for mine. Styles opened his mouth to protest, but before he could utter a word, Orion merged with the winds, his form dissolving into the night air. Styles stood there, eyes wide, mouth open, hands outstretched in disbelief. Are you kidding me? He exclaimed into the empty air, feeling a mix of awe and frustration. Realizing he was on his own, Styles took a deep breath and refocused. Okay, Styles, you can do this, he muttered to himself. Scott needs you. Drawing on his vampire speed, Styles took off again, following the path Scott had taken. He moved with a renewed sense of urgency, determined to catch up with his best friend before things got out of hand. 15 comments 0 vote. Hunters. Scott came to a sudden stop in front of a tree, his eyes immediately locking onto Allison's jacket hanging on one of the branches. His heart raced as he scanned the area, his heightened senses picking up the faint breathing and heartbeat of Derek nearby. Derek. Scott called out, his voice a mix of urgency and anger. Where is she? From the shadows, Derek's calm voice replied, she's safe, Scott. Safe from you. Before Scott could react, Derek lunged at him. They collided with a force that sent them both rolling on the ground. Derek managed to pin Scott against a tree, his grip strong and unyielding. Scott struggled, his eyes blazing golden yellow. Get off me, Derek. Just then, Styles appeared, his eyes glowing a fierce red. With supernatural strength, he grabbed Derek by the shoulder and hurled him away. Derek flew through the air, crashing into another tree. He looked up in surprise, clearly taken aback by Styles' strength. How does a young vampire possess such power? Derek muttered to himself, staring at Styles with a mixture of awe and suspicion. But he didn't have time for questions. He sensed danger approaching. The hunters are coming. You boys need to run, now. Derek didn't wait for a response. He took off into the woods, his form disappearing into the shadows. Scott and Styles turned to flee, but before they could move, a flash arrow shot past them, exploding in a burst of light that momentarily blinded them. Another arrow followed swiftly, aimed directly at Scott. With his enhanced senses, Scott caught the arrow just before it could hit him. Holding the arrow, Scott looked up and locked eyes with the shooter. He captured the man's face, imprinting it in his memory. The shooter, clad in dark gear, was clearly one of the hunters Derek had warned them about. Run. Derek's voice echoed through the woods, urging them on. Scott and Styles didn't hesitate. They sprinted away from the clearing, their supernatural speed allowing them to put distance between themselves and the hunters. As they ran, Scott's mind raced with the realization of the new dangers they faced. He clutched Allison's jacket tightly, vowing to protect her at all costs. They burst through the edge of the woods, their breath heavy but their resolve stronger than ever. The night was far from over, and they knew they were only at the beginning of a much larger fight. Dash dash dash. Scott and Styles didn't slow their pace until they reached the edge of Beacon Hills. They found themselves in a quiet residential neighborhood, far removed from the chaos of the forest. Scott finally came to a stop, breathing heavily but still clutching Allison's jacket as if it were a lifeline. Styles, equally winded but driven by adrenaline, glanced around nervously. What the hell was that about? He demanded. Hunters. What are hunters and since when do we have hunters in Beacon Hills? Scott shook his head, still trying to process everything that had happened. I don't know, Styles. But Derek seemed pretty convinced. His voice trailed off, the implications too heavy to articulate. Styles placed a reassuring hand on Scott's shoulder. We'll figure this out. But first, we need to get you calmed down. Your heart's racing like crazy, and your eyes. They're still glowing, dude. Scott took a deep breath, focusing on his breathing, willing his body to relax. Slowly, the golden hue faded from his eyes, leaving him looking exhausted but determined. Okay. I'm good. Let's get to Allison's house. We need to make sure she's really safe. They began walking at a brisk pace towards Allison's neighborhood, the tension between them palpable. Scott's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears, each one centering around Allison and the mysterious hunters. Styles, always the voice of reason, tried to lighten the mood. You know, this would be a lot easier if we had some kind of supernatural handbook. How to deal with hunters and not die 101. Think they offer that at Beacon Hills High. Scott managed a weak smile. Maybe we should write one. As they approached Allison's house, they slowed their pace, moving with caution. The house was dark, save for a single light in the living room. Scott's enhanced vision picked up movement inside, and his heart leapt into his throat. She's home, Scott whispered, relief washing over him. But the feeling was short-lived as he noticed another figure moving in the shadows near the house. Derek, Styles muttered, his eyes narrowing. What's he doing here? Scott motioned for Styles to stay back as he crept closer to the house, his senses on high alert. Derek emerged from the shadows, his eyes locking onto Scott's with a mix of frustration and concern. I told you to stay away, Derek growled, his voice low and dangerous. Scott clenched his fists, barely containing his anger. I just want to make sure she's safe. Derek sighed, glancing towards the house. She's inside. Safe. But the hunters are getting closer. You being here is putting her at risk. Before Scott could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching from behind made him turn. Styles had followed, his expression determined. We're not leaving her unprotected. If the hunters are coming, we need to be ready. Derek shook his head, clearly torn. You don't understand. These aren't ordinary hunters. They're organized, well-trained. They know what they're doing. And they're not just after you, Scott. They're after all of us. Scott felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, all of us? Derek's gaze hardened. Every supernatural creature in Beacon Hills is a target. They've been planning this for a long time. Scott felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean, all of us? Derek's gaze hardened. Every supernatural creature in Beacon Hills is a target. They've been planning this for a long time. Scott looked at Styles, who nodded in agreement. Styles' eyes still glowed red, reflecting the tension and readiness for battle. Scott knew they were in over their heads, but leaving Allison unprotected was not an option. Derek, we need to. Scott, Derek interrupted, his tone firm. You being here is what's putting Allison in danger. You need to leave. Now. Scott opened his mouth to protest, but Derek's expression was resolute. There was a mix of urgency and an unspoken plea in his eyes. Scott clenched his fists, feeling the weight of responsibility and the fear of leaving Allison. He glanced back at the house, imagining Allison safe inside, unaware of the imminent threat. Reluctantly, Scott nodded. Fine. But this isn't over. Derek's eyes softened slightly. I'll make sure she stays safe. Now go. Scott turned, his heart heavy with the decision. As he took a step back, his eyes met Styles. Let's go. Styles hesitated, his gaze lingering on Derek for a moment. Then, with a final nod, he vamped speed into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Scott followed suit, his enhanced speed carrying him far away from the house and deeper into the forest. 13 comments 0 vote. Melissa and Orion. Scott, it's time for school. Get your ass out here, right this instant. Melissa called out sharply, her voice firm as she finished arranging breakfast on the table. Her movements were quick and precise, the clatter of plates and utensils softened by the warm scent of pancakes and bacon that filled the room. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, waiting for a response from her son, but none came. She sighed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face, but her focus remained on preparing everything just right. As she placed the last dish down, the door creaked open, and Orion strolled in with a scowl darkening his features. His broad shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. If I get my hands on those druids, he growled, the anger simmering in his voice, they're going to wish they'd never been born. But as his eyes landed on Melissa, his expression softened, a slow smile pulling at the corner of his lips. Well, well. What do we have here? My beautiful mate, preparing breakfast just for me. Melissa barely looked up, but a knowing smirk tugged at her mouth as she placed the last dish with a soft clink. These aren't for you, she replied, her voice light but with a teasing edge. She straightened, folding her arms over her chest as she finally met his gaze. They're for my boys, and you know better than to barge into someone's house uninvited. Orion chuckled, the deep sound rumbling in his chest. His eyes twinkled with amusement as he stepped closer, leaning against the doorframe with a lazy confidence. Oh please, he said, flashing a toothy grin that showed off his sharp canines, you and I both know you made all of this with me in mind. As for barging in, he pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room in a few long strides, settling into a chair at the table. His gaze never left hers as he leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. This was your home, and you are mine. Melissa rolled her eyes, but there was a faint, barely noticeable flicker of warmth in her expression, a fleeting softness that she quickly masked. She turned away, focusing on wiping her hands with the dish towel, though the faintest hint of a smile remained on her lips. You're impossible, she muttered under her breath, though the fondness in her tone betrayed her. Upstairs, Scott pressed his palms tightly over his ears, gritting his teeth as his mother's voice mingled with Orion's deep, teasing laughter from downstairs. Despite his efforts, it was impossible to block out the conversation, his heightened senses, a constant reminder of his werewolf nature, made sure of that. The murmurs, the clinking of dishes, every breath of their exchange filtered through, sharp and clear. With a groan of frustration, Scott sat up on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. I'm never going to get used to this, he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with resignation. He glanced at the clock and realized he had no time to dwell on his mom's new romantic situation. He needed to get ready for school. Dragging himself into the bathroom, Scott splashed cold water on his face, hoping to jolt himself out of his thoughts. His reflection stared back at him, troubled. As he dried off and stepped out, his bare feet patting softly on the floor, a new thought froze him in his tracks. Allison. His heart sank as the memory of last night at Lydia's party came flooding back, how he'd bolted out of the room without a word, how the full moon had taken hold, making him lose control. What am I going to tell Allison? He murmured, the weight of it settling on his chest. His reflection seemed to frown at him, as if offering no solace. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her that he was a werewolf, that the reason he ran out was because the full moon had pulled at the darkest parts of him, the parts he couldn't contain. Lost in thought, Scott didn't notice the creak of his bedroom door until a familiar voice broke through. Oh, finally realizing you still have to talk to Allison, huh? Scott's head jerked up, startled, and he turned toward his bed to find Styles sprawled out comfortably on top of it, flipping through one of Scott's books. His best friend dropped the book onto the mattress and gave him a knowing smile, eyes glinting with playful mischief. Jesus, Styles. Scott exhaled, his pulse still racing from the surprise. Styles, unfazed, leaned back, propping his head up on one hand as if he belonged there. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, but you've got this brooding look on your face, Styles said, gesturing towards Scott with a wave of his hand. Classic, I messed up with Allison, look. Scott rubbed the back of his neck, his brow furrowing in frustration. Yeah, well, it's not like I can just tell her the truth, can I? Styles tilted his head slightly, his playful smirk softening into something more sympathetic. He could see the weight Scott was carrying, even though his friend tried to hide it. No, Styles agreed, his voice softer now, but you're gonna have to tell her something. I know, Scott muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration, his brow furrowed. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. But right now, I just need to get out of this house. His voice was tight, the weight of last night's events and the awkward tension with his mother bearing down on him. He grabbed his clothes with a quick, sharp motion, pulling on his shirt with a bit more force than necessary. Styles, who had been watching his friend with a mix of concern and quiet amusement, stood up from the bed and followed. Lead the way, man, he said, his voice light, but his eyes flickered with understanding. As they made their way downstairs, Scott's pace quickened, almost as if he couldn't get out fast enough. The smell of breakfast greeted him, but he barely glanced at the spread on the table. His mother stood by the counter, sipping her coffee, her eyes warm and expectant. She smiled at him, clearly hoping for some acknowledgement, but Scott's focus was elsewhere. Morning, Mom, he mumbled, his tone rushed as he snatched a few items off the table, an apple, a granola bar, without even making eye contact. His movements were mechanical, hurried, his mind already on the day ahead and the weight of what he had to face with Allison. He didn't wait for a reply, the door already in his sights as he bolted toward it, the tension in his shoulders visible with every step. Melissa watched him go, her brow furrowing slightly in concern. Have a good day, Scott, she called after him, though she knew he hadn't really heard her. Styles, a step behind, lingered for a moment. Unlike Scott, he met Melissa's gaze with a bright smile, his usual cheerfulness cutting through the awkwardness Scott had left behind. Morning, Mrs. McCall, he said, his tone full of the charm that usually softened any tension in a room. Then his eyes flicked to Orion, still sitting at the table, his muscular form relaxed but commanding. Styles gave him a nod, not wanting to seem impolite. Orion, he added, trying his best to act natural, though the intensity of Orion's presence always made him a little uneasy. Orion looked up, meeting Styles' gaze with a lazy grin. Styles, he replied, his voice deep, almost amused. His sharp eyes flicked toward the door Scott had just exited, the slightest hint of a smirk on his lips as he took a sip of his coffee. Styles gave a small, awkward wave before quickly following Scott out of the house, feeling the weight of Orion's gaze on his back until the door closed behind him. Outside, he caught up to Scott, who was already halfway down the driveway, his posture tense. You know, you could have at least said, hi, to the guy, Styles said, glancing at Scott, but his friend remained silent, his expression unreadable. Jackson A. Lesson. So, you're going to start teaching at the school, Orion? Melissa asked, her hands moving gracefully as she began clearing the plates off the table. Her eyes flicked to him, curiosity sparking in their depths. The soft clatter of dishes filled the room, but her attention remained on Orion, watching for his reaction. Orion leaned back into the couch, stretching out like a large, lazy cat. His muscular frame sank into the cushions, exuding a kind of casual dominance. He shrugged, his expression unreadable, though the corner of his mouth twitched with faint amusement. Might as well, he said, his voice deep and relaxed. It's where all the action seems to go down, and I could use something to pass the time. Melissa's brow furrowed slightly as she gathered the last dish, her movements pausing for a moment as she considered his words. She looked over at him, one hand resting on her hip. And what exactly are you going to teach the students? Her tone was curious but edged with a subtle skepticism, knowing Orion's unpredictable nature. Orion's lips curved into a sly grin, though his eyes remained closed. Don't know yet, he said, his voice laced with an almost teasing nonchalance. Maybe I'll teach them some of my own stuff. Melissa raised an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth twitching as she dried her hands. Your own stuff. She echoed, her voice carrying a hint of both intrigue and caution. She took a step closer, watching him closely, waiting for more details. Orion cracked open one eye, his gaze meeting hers with a glint of mischief. Yeah, he said, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a secret. Stuff that'll either make them stronger, or scare them senseless. His smile widened, clearly enjoying the mystery. Melissa shook her head with a soft chuckle, though there was a playful spark in her eyes. Just make sure you don't break any of them, all right? She teased, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed as she watched him with a mixture of amusement and wariness. Orion stretched his arms behind his head, his grin still in place as he closed his eyes again. No promises, he murmured, his tone lazy but holding a hint of danger. Beacon Hills High. Scott and Styles were walking towards their lockers, chatting casually, when out of nowhere, Jackson grabbed Scott by the collar and slammed him against the lockers with a loud thud. The clang of metal echoed through the hallway, drawing the attention of the few students nearby. Jackson's face was twisted in anger, his jaw clenched as he leaned in close to Scott, their noses almost touching. Styles, Jackson growled, his voice low and menacing, his eyes never leaving Scott's. Before I start knocking the teeth out of your friend here, I want you to tell me what you're taking, who your supplier is, and how I can get in touch with him. Styles, standing a few feet away, barely looked fazed. He glanced over, his expression more bored than worried, arms crossed over his chest as he sighed. He wasn't too concerned, fully aware of what Scott was capable of now. But then, something strange happened. Scott's eyes darted to the ground, his breathing quickening. He looked scared. Styles frowned in confusion, waiting for Scott to shove Jackson away or give him that wolfish glare that would make Jackson back off in an instant. But Scott wasn't doing any of that. Instead, he was stammering, his voice shaky. I don't know what you're talking about, Scott mumbled, his body tense as Jackson's grip tightened. Styles' eyebrows shot up, surprise flickering across his face. Why wasn't Scott handling this? He could knock Jackson across the hall without breaking a sweat. Styles shook his head and sighed heavily. All right, guess I have to step in, he thought. Styles uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his tone sharp. Hey, let go of him before I start knocking your teeth out. He echoed Jackson's own threat with a dry smirk, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jackson chuckled darkly, his lips curling into a sneer as he finally let go of Scott, but not before giving him a hard shove against the locker. Scott stumbled back, wincing as his shoulder hit the metal. Ha! Jackson scoffed, turning to Styles, his arrogant smirk widening. I bet whatever you're taking is really strong if it's making you actually believe you could take me. He rolled his shoulders, flexing as he stalked toward Styles, his posture radiating confidence, maybe even a little cockiness. Styles just smiled. It wasn't the nervous, twitchy grin Jackson might have been expecting, it was calm, almost too calm. Styles stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and his eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. Oh, you wouldn't believe it, Styles said, his voice smooth, a hint of amusement in his tone. He stood his ground, feet planted firmly, as Jackson approached, his smile never wavering. It doesn't just make me believe I could take you, it makes me able to do it. Jackson stopped, his eyes narrowing as he noticed Styles' stance. There was something different about him, something unnerving. The arrogance in Jackson's eyes flickered for just a second, but he dismissed it, chuckling again, though this time, there was a slight hesitation in his laugh. Styles took a breath, rolling his shoulders, ready. He didn't need to put his full strength into this, just enough to send Jackson a message. As Jackson's fist hurtled toward Styles, his face twisted into a smug sneer, fully expecting his punch to land. But to his surprise, Styles caught his fist mid-air with ease his grip like a steel vise. For a moment, Jackson's eyes widened, his bravado faltering as he stared at his fist trapped in Styles' hand. Styles' face remained calm, but there was a glint in his eyes, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. He gave Jackson's wrist a small, dismissive twist forcing the jock to stumble forward, his confidence slipping away with each second. Now, I think it's my turn, Styles said quietly his voice low but carrying a dangerous certainty. Without a second's hesitation, Styles pivoted his body, his arm swinging with perfect precision. His punch landed square on Jackson's jaw with a resounding crack, the impact sending a ripple through the hall. Jackson's head snapped to the side, his eyes dazed as his body crumpled backward, crashing into the lockers with a thud. Blood trickled from his mouth, and as he groaned, a tooth bounced to the floor, echoing against the tiles. Jackson's hands instinctively went to his face, his breath ragged as he tried to process what had just happened. Styles stood there, his knuckles barely even bruised, shaking off his fist with an air of nonchalance. He glanced down at Jackson with a casual smirk. Guess I wasn't lying about knocking your teeth out, huh? Scott stared, wide-eyed, still leaning against the locker, disbelief written all over his face. Styles had just knocked Jackson out cold, something he'd never seen coming. Jackson's face twisted in pain, his earlier cockiness completely shattered. His chest heaved as he clutched his jaw, asterisk asterisk, and for the first time, he looked up at Styles not with arrogance, but with genuine fear. Scott glanced at Styles, concern etched on his face as he bent down to help Jackson up. Don't you think that was a little extreme? He asked quietly, his hand outstretched toward Jackson, but the other boy shoved him aside with a sharp glare, clearly humiliated. Styles, still shaking off the tension, barely seemed to notice Scott's question. His eyes were fixed elsewhere. He tilted his head slightly, a small, almost disbelieving smile playing on his lips. I don't think so, he muttered, not really responding to Scott but more to himself. And for the first time, she's looking right back at me. Scott frowned in confusion, following Styles' gaze across the hallway. There, in the distance, Lydia Martin stood with a small group of friends, her fiery hair catching the light. But she wasn't engaged in the usual gossip or ignoring the world around her. Instead, her eyes were locked on Styles, a look of curiosity flickering behind her usual confident, detached expression. Her head tilted ever so slightly, almost as if she was reassessing the boy she had never paid attention to before. Styles' grin widened just a little as their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no dismissive glance from Lydia. No rolling of her eyes. Just interest. Scott glanced between them, bemused, and let out a soft sigh. Well, that's new. 15 comments, 0 vote. Pissed. Download the app for additional rewards. More events, more perks. Winning you more free perks. Download now. Adams 2004. Download app now. Lydia confronts Styles. Scott and Styles walked down the hall, the events of the confrontation with Jackson still lingering in the air, the tension between them thick like a fog. Scott kept his eyes on the floor, his hands stuffed in his pockets as they made their way toward the classroom. He felt the residual adrenaline in his veins, but his mind kept circling back to the strange feeling he had when Styles took down Jackson. Styles, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with energy, his hands animated as he talked about the fight, replaying it in exaggerated detail for anyone who would listen. He seemed unfazed, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. His usual smile was wide, a bit cocky, but there was something else in his eyes, something that hinted at satisfaction, but also something deeper, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. As they entered the classroom, Styles took his usual seat beside Scott, who found his gaze immediately drawn to Allison, seated just a few rows ahead of him. She was talking to Lynn, a girl in one of Lydia's many circles, her expression calm, but Scott could see the faint crease in her brow as she spoke, an underlying concern that only those who knew her well would notice. He shifted in his seat, trying not to stare, but his thoughts were tangled around the image of her, the soft curve of her neck, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Hey, Styles whispered to him, leaning in close with a mischievous glint in his eyes. You gonna stare at her all period, or are you gonna talk to her at some point? Scott's face flushed, and he quickly turned his head, attempting to brush it off. Shut up, Styles, he muttered, though there was a soft smile tugging at his lips. But before Styles could retort, the door to the classroom slammed open with a force that made everyone jump. Lydia Martin strode in, her fiery red hair practically glowing in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Her eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating, before settling on Scott and Styles. Without so much as a greeting, she crossed the room with purpose, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythmic precision that matched the intensity in her gaze. When she reached them, she stood in front of Scott and Styles, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She began, her tone sharp and demanding, a layer of cool detachment laced through her words. What happened out there in the hall? Her eyes were piercing, staring directly at Styles, then flicking to Scott with a questioning look, her lips pressed together in a tight line. There was no room for evasion in her voice, no trace of hesitation. Lydia wasn't someone who asked questions she didn't already have an answer to. Scott shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between Lydia and Styles. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the pressure to answer, but his thoughts were still a little clouded. He wasn't sure how much of the truth they should reveal, not yet, at least. Styles, however, was already leaning back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips as he regarded Lydia. His expression was casual, almost nonchalant, but there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface, a mix of amusement and something harder to place. He wasn't backing down. You mean about Jackson getting his teeth knocked out? Styles said, his voice smooth, but carrying an edge. Well, I suppose you could say he had a run-in with reality. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with a quiet confidence that was at odds with his usual playful tone. Lydia's gaze didn't shift from Styles, though the faintest raise of her eyebrow suggested she was intrigued. She didn't show it outright, but it was there, a flicker of interest that she quickly masked with her usual coolness. Her eyes narrowed as she processed his words, but she didn't speak immediately. Scott shifted again, this time glancing at Allison, who was watching the interaction from a distance, her face unreadable. He could see the faint line of worry on her forehead, but her eyes never left Lydia and Styles. She wasn't one to be easily intimidated, but something about the way Lydia carried herself seemed to make everyone pause. "You're not gonna tell me anything, are you?" Lydia's voice cut through the silence, the words almost like a challenge. She stepped forward, leaning in slightly as if trying to read their expressions for any hint of a lie. Styles' lips curled into a slight smile, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. "Maybe we're just trying to teach you a lesson in not being so nosy," he said, his tone playful but with an underlying sharpness that made it clear he wasn't intimidated by her presence. Lydia's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but her lips quirked up in a barely perceptible smirk, acknowledging the game they were playing. She wasn't so easily dismissed, and yet, she wasn't pressing further, at least not yet. The brief pause that followed was heavy with unsaid words, an almost electric charge between them. Styles tilted his head slightly, his gaze still steady on Lydia, but now there was a soft shift in his demeanor, a deeper understanding in his eyes. "But, if you really want to know," he said, his voice lowering just a touch, "we can talk about it after class." His words hung in the air, a silent invitation, or perhaps, a silent warning. Lydia didn't respond right away. Her eyes lingered on Styles for a moment longer before she straightened up, her posture returning to its usual commanding presence. She didn't smile, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, as if she'd just learned something new. Something she hadn't expected. With a final glance at both of them, Lydia turned on her heel and walked back to her seat, leaving behind a palpable tension that filled the room, making everyone shift slightly in their seats. Scott looked at Styles, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and awe. "What was that?" he whispered under his breath. Styles just shrugged, his grin returning, though it was tinged with something a little more dangerous. "Guess we'll find out soon enough." 8 comments 0 vote. Orion at school. The chatter in the classroom buzzed like static electricity, faintly hushed yet charged with curiosity after Lydia's departure. Styles tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, the rhythm faint and aimless, while Scott shifted uneasily, still glancing over at Allison every few seconds. The door creaked open, cutting through the ambient noise, and the classroom fell silent almost instantly. A man walked in, his presence commanding without effort, like the air had suddenly thickened. Orion moved with a deliberate ease, his tall, broad frame exuding quiet confidence. His hair, white as freshly fallen snow, shimmered under the fluorescent lights, while his golden eyes, impossibly vivid, swept across the room with an almost predatory awareness. Allison stiffened in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched him. Lydia, who was casually flipping through her notebook, froze mid-page, her lips parting ever so slightly in surprise. Even Jackson, sitting with his jaw still tender from earlier, blinked at Orion, his usual bravado faltering as if something about the man unsettled him. But Scott and Styles exchanged only a glance. There was no shock in their expressions, just a knowing calm. Styles leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, and raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Scott, though quieter, had his attention fixed on Orion, his expression unreadable but alert. Orion stopped in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, and looked around. His smile was slow and deliberate, curving with an almost feline amusement as he seemed to revel in the tension. "Well," he began, his voice deep and smooth, with a faint, almost playful edge, "I can see you're all captivated by something, or someone." A faint chuckle rippled through the room, though it was more nervous than amused. Orion tilted his head slightly, his white hair falling over his forehead, the golden hues of his eyes catching the light as he looked directly at Lydia, then at Jackson. His smile widened. "Let me guess. It's the hair, right?" he said, gesturing casually toward himself. "Or maybe the eyes. Golden and white together, rare combo. People always ask me if it's natural." He paused for effect, then added, "It's not." His smile turned roguish, his gaze flickering with mischief, and a few students laughed, though the sound was uncertain, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to relax. Lydia's lips twitched at the corners, though she quickly masked it with her usual cool demeanor. Allison's expression softened slightly, though her brow remained furrowed, as if she were trying to figure him out. But don't worry, Orion continued, his tone lighter now, as he strode toward the front of the classroom. His steps were fluid, measured, like a big cat strolling through its domain. He turned, leaning casually against the desk, arms crossing over his chest as he faced the class. I'm not here to hypnotize you with my dazzling appearance. I'm here to teach. There was a beat of silence before he spoke again, his voice lowering slightly, drawing the students in. The name's Orion, he said, his tone slower now, almost intimate, like he was telling them something meant only for their ears. And for the next semester, I'll be introducing you to a subject most of you probably don't even believe in yet. Styles straightened in his seat, his smirk fading as his interest sharpened. Scott tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. Allison leaned forward ever so slightly, her fingers curling lightly over the edge of her notebook. Even Lydia, who rarely showed more than polite disinterest, was now sitting perfectly still, her gaze locked on Orion with an intensity she rarely revealed. The occult, Orion said simply, letting the word hang in the air like a held breath. Mysteries of the unknown. The unexplainable. The things that go bump in the night. His golden eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on each student, as if daring them to question him. And the things that don't. A few students exchanged uneasy glances. Someone in the back whispered, is this guy for real? Earning a sharp glare from Lydia. Orion didn't seem to mind. If anything, his smile grew wider. Most of you probably think this is some elective fluff class, he said, his tone suddenly cutting through the room like a blade. A chance to slack off, maybe even take a nap. He straightened, his arms falling to his sides as he stepped closer to the students. But I promise you, by the time this semester's over, you won't be able to sleep at all. The tension in the room spiked. Jackson, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, now shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Lydia tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Orion with a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Allison's fingers twitched as she took her pen and began jotting something down, though her eyes flicked up to Orion every few seconds. Styles broke the silence with a low whistle. Well, that's one way to make a first impression, he muttered under his breath, earning a sideways glance from Scott. Orion's gaze flicked to Styles, his golden eyes glinting with something that felt almost like recognition. You look like someone who enjoys a good mystery, he said, his voice lighter now, but no less direct. Styles grinned, leaning forward on his desk, his usual bravado returning. I do, he said, his tone matching Orion's playful energy. As long as I don't end up as one. Orion chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. Stick around, kid, he said, turning his attention back to the rest of the class. You just might learn how to avoid that. As he began to outline the syllabus, his voice captivating despite the unusual topic, there was a palpable shift in the room. The initial unease was giving way to curiosity, the kind that made every student sit a little straighter, lean in a little closer. Scott exchanged another glance with Styles, his expression not very good as he is wondering what the hell he was doing here. 6 comments 0 vote. Confronting Orion. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and a faint ripple of tension eased through the room. Chairs scraped against the floor as students began gathering their things, their conversations low and cautious, as though they were still processing what had just transpired. Orion remained at the front of the room, leaning casually against the desk, his golden eyes flicking briefly to each student as they filed out. His expression was unreadable, part amused, part contemplative. Scott lingered at his desk, his gaze locked on Orion. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed together as if trying to contain a storm of questions. Styles stood beside him, slinging his bag over one shoulder, his usual smirk tempered by curiosity. He nudged Scott with his elbow. Don't blow a gasket, dude, he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual playfulness. Let's just see where this goes. Scott didn't respond. He watched as Orion pushed away from the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, and made his way toward the door. Without hesitation, Scott stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Orion paused in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, and glanced over his shoulder. A knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Coming to escort me out, Scott? He asked, his tone smooth, almost teasing. Scott didn't answer, his expression dark and determined as he moved quickly toward him. Styles followed with a resigned sigh, muttering something under his breath about this being a bad idea. The three of them exited the classroom, leaving behind a sea of curious glances. The hallway was quieter now, the rush of students thinning as they dispersed to their next classes. Orion walked ahead with an easy stride, his hands tucked into his pockets as though he had all the time in the world. His white hair glowed faintly under the fluorescent lights, and his golden eyes seemed to flicker with an inner light, catching every movement around him. Scott caught up with him in just a few long strides. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, tension rolling off him like a gathering storm. Styles, a step behind, stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, his face set in a cautious frown as he watched the interaction unfold. "What are you doing here?" Scott asked abruptly, his voice low but laced with an unmistakable edge of frustration. Orion stopped, turning slowly to face him. His expression was calm, his head tilting slightly as though considering Scott's words. "Well, hello to you too, Scott," he said smoothly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'd ask how you're doing, but you seem a little tense." Scott took a step closer, his brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. "That's not an answer," he said sharply. "Why are you here? Why my school?" Styles raised an eyebrow, his gaze darting between the two of them. "Okay, not that I'm against the whole stepdad-son bonding thing," he said, his tone deliberately light, "but I'm guessing this isn't just about sharing lunch breaks and class schedules." Orion let out a low chuckle, the sound rich and unhurried. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back slightly as though settling in for a conversation he found mildly entertaining. "Boredom, mostly," he said finally, his golden eyes meeting Scott's with a glimmer of amusement. "I needed a change of pace. Something to do." Scott's frown deepened, his disbelief clear in the way his shoulders tensed. "And teaching here was the first thing you thought of?" Orion shrugged, his movements fluid and unbothered. "Why not?" he said, his tone casual. Seemed like an interesting challenge. "And besides," he added, a hint of warmth creeping into his voice, "what better way to spend time with my stepson than to come work at his school?" Styles let out a low whistle, his eyes widening slightly as he glanced at Scott. "Well, that's one way to drop a bombshell," he muttered, though there was a flicker of something softer in his expression, understanding, maybe even sympathy. Scott's expression faltered for a moment, a brief flicker of vulnerability crossing his face before he quickly masked it with frustration. "This isn't a game," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "You can't just." "Relax, Scott," Orion interrupted gently, though his tone carried an undercurrent of authority that made Scott pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help." Scott blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in Orion's voice. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to waver, though it didn't dissipate entirely. Styles cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Okay, so, ground rules," he offered, his tone deliberately casual. "Like, maybe don't freak out the entire student body on your first day." Orion laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "I'll do my best," he said, glancing at Styles with a faint smirk. "But no promises." Scott exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. "This better not blow up in our faces," he muttered, though there was less bite in his words now. Orion's smile softened, and for a moment, there was something almost paternal in his gaze. "Trust me," he said quietly. "I'm here for the right reasons." As Orion turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him down the hall with ease, Scott and Styles stood in silence for a moment. "You think he means that?" Scott asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Styles glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "I think he's a wild card," he said, shrugging lightly. "But sometimes, those are the ones you need the most." 4 comments 0 vote. Chris Argent. The school day drew to a close, and the hallways buzzed with the familiar chaos of lockers slamming, hurried footsteps, and the murmur of conversations. Scott moved quickly through the crowd, his eyes scanning ahead as he searched for Allison. His heart thudded heavily, not with nerves, but with purpose. He had waited long enough to say what needed to be said. There she was, standing near the entrance, her hair catching the late afternoon light filtering through the windows. Allison was rifling through her bag, her expression calm but distant, as though she was lost in thought. Scott hesitated for only a moment before making his way over. "Allison," he called, his voice just loud enough to rise above the noise. She looked up, her expression brightening briefly at the sight of him, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She closed her bag and slung it over her shoulder as he approached. "Hey," she said softly, her tone polite but guarded. Scott stopped a few steps away, his hands slipping nervously into his pockets. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes earnest as they searched hers. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he said, his voice low but firm. For leaving so suddenly at Lydia's party. That wasn't fair to you. Allison blinked, her lips parting slightly as she processed his words. Her expression softened, though there was still a trace of wariness in her gaze. It's okay, she said after a moment, her voice gentle. I mean, it wasn't great, but, she trailed off, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. Is everything okay? You seemed off that night. Scott exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of his guilt had been pressing down on him. It's complicated, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't about you. I promise. Allison tilted her head, her brow furrowing as she stepped closer. Scott, if something's wrong, you can tell me, she said, her voice tinged with concern. You don't have to deal with it alone. Her kindness hit him like a wave, and he felt a pang of regret for the secrets he couldn't share. But before he could respond, a low voice cut through the air like a blade. Allison. Scott turned his head sharply, his body tensing instinctively. Standing a few feet away was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark, piercing eyes. His presence was commanding, the kind that demanded attention without effort. He was dressed neatly, his expression calm but unreadable as he looked between Scott and his daughter. Allison's face lit up in a smile, her demeanor instantly relaxing. Dad, she said, her voice warm as she stepped toward him. Scott froze, his heart racing as recognition dawned on him. This was the man. The hunter. The one who had shot him in the woods that night. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Hi, Allison's father said, his voice even but laced with quiet authority. He extended a hand toward Scott, his gaze unwavering. Chris Argent. Scott hesitated for half a second before reaching out to shake his hand. Chris's grip was firm, his eyes boring into Scott's with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was no immediate sign of recognition, but Scott couldn't shake the feeling that Chris was sizing him up, looking for something. Scott McCall, he said, his voice steady despite the rapid pounding of his heart. Chris nodded, his expression polite but distant. You're the one Allison's been spending time with, he said, his tone casual but deliberate. Scott swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Yeah, we've hung out a bit. Allison glanced between them, her smile faltering slightly as she seemed to pick up on the tension. Dad, she said, her tone light but with an edge of exasperation, Scott's a good guy. You don't have to interrogate him. Chris's lips quirked in a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Just making sure, he said, his gaze lingering on Scott for a moment longer before shifting back to Allison. Ready to go. Yeah, Allison said, giving Scott a small, apologetic smile. I'll see you tomorrow. Scott nodded, his smile tight. Yeah. Tomorrow. As Allison and Chris walked away, Scott's hands curled into fists at his sides, his breathing shallow as he watched them go. He could feel the weight of Chris's presence even after he was out of sight, the tension in the air refusing to dissipate. Stiles appeared at Scott's side, his expression concerned. Well, that looked intense, he said, his tone light but edged with unease. You okay? Scott exhaled slowly, shaking his head. That's him, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. The hunter. That's Allison's dad. Stiles's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly in disbelief. Wait, what? He whispered harshly. You mean the guy who tried to kill you is her dad? Scott nodded, his jaw tight as his gaze remained fixed on the spot where Chris had disappeared. Yeah, he said, his voice trembling slightly. And he has no idea. 4 comments 0 vote. Scott tells Orion about the Argents. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting pale silver light over the quiet woods where Scott and Orion had agreed to meet. Scott paced nervously near the clearing, his breaths coming in uneven bursts. His mind raced as he replayed the events from earlier, the handshake, the piercing gaze, and the gut-wrenching realization. Orion stood calmly a few feet away, leaning against a large tree with an air of unbothered ease. The light breeze rustled his dark, unkempt hair, and his arms were crossed loosely over his chest. He watched Scott with a patient, almost amused expression, as though waiting for the storm of words he knew was coming. Finally, Scott stopped pacing and turned to face Orion, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You won't believe this, he began, his voice taut with urgency. The hunters. Allison's dad, Chris Argent, he's one of them. He's the one who shot me in the woods. Orion's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes glinting with something unreadable in the dim light. I know, he said simply, his voice calm and measured. Scott's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened, and he took a step closer, his hands unclenching as he stared at Orion in disbelief. You know. He repeated, his voice rising slightly. You knew, and you didn't tell me. Orion let out a long, quiet sigh, pushing himself off the tree with a graceful, fluid motion. He stood tall now, his presence imposing yet strangely calm. I didn't see the need, he said with a shrug, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Scott stared at him, his jaw tightening as his confusion turned to frustration. You didn't see the need. He echoed, his voice trembling. Orion, he's a hunter. He's been trained to kill people like us, like me. He almost did kill me. Orion regarded him with a steady gaze, his lips curling into a faint, enigmatic smile. Scott, he said, his tone laced with a peculiar mix of amusement and nostalgia. I've known the Argents for centuries. I knew their ancestors, the ones who started the family line. And let me tell you, those were glorious days. Scott blinked, his anger momentarily giving way to shock. He stepped back, his head shaking slightly as he struggled to process Orion's words. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice quieter now but still tinged with disbelief. You knew them. The original Argents. Orion's smile deepened, and he began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were savoring the story he was about to tell. Oh, yes, he said, his voice rich with nostalgia. The Argents were fearless people, hunters unlike any you've seen today. They had honor, discipline, and an unshakable belief in their cause. They weren't just hunters. They were my friends. Scott watched him, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. That's great, Orion, he said, his tone biting. But what does that have to do with me? With now. They're still trying to kill us. Orion stopped pacing and turned to face Scott, his expression softening slightly. They're not trying to kill you, he said pointedly. Not yet. Chris Argent doesn't even know what you are. Scott clenched his fists again, his frustration bubbling over. That's not the point. He snapped. The point is you knew, and you didn't warn me. You let me walk right into this without saying anything. Orion tilted his head again, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Scott. You're stronger than you think, Scott, he said, his voice calm but firm. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see it for yourself. To understand who the Argents are, and who you are. Scott shook his head, his frustration giving way to a deep, sinking feeling of betrayal. I trusted you, he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. You're supposed to have my back. But instead, you let me walk into a trap. Orion's expression softened further, and he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Scott, he said gently, his voice steady, I didn't let you walk into a trap. I let you see the truth. The hunters are part of this world, just as we are. And if you're going to survive, if you're going to protect the people you care about, you need to face them head on. Scott's shoulders sagged, his anger draining away as he processed Orion's words. He glanced down at the ground, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and determination. Orion placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. You'll be all right, Scott, he said, his voice low and steady. You're stronger than you realize. And you're not alone. Scott looked up, his eyes meeting Orion's. For a moment, he saw something in the older man's gaze, something ancient and unyielding, but also kind. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly as he tried to steady himself. All right, he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. What do we do now? Orion's enigmatic smile returned, and he gave Scott's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Now, he said, his tone light but firm, we prepare. Because if the Argents are in play, things are about to get a lot more interesting. 4 comments 0 vote. Training. The clearing was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves, the world around them hushed as if holding its breath. Orion's words lingered in the air, heavy with the promise of things to come. Scott's jaw tightened, and his brow furrowed as he absorbed the weight of what lay ahead. He straightened his posture, his fists relaxing as resolve settled over him. Orion's sharp gaze never left him, his eyes gleaming with quiet approval. He nodded, his expression unreadable but tinged with a faint, knowing smile. Good, Orion said, his deep voice carrying a note of finality. Now that you've seen what we're up against, it's time to stop running and start preparing. Scott's eyes narrowed slightly, determination sparking in their amber depths. What do you mean by prepare? He asked, his voice steady but cautious. Orion turned away, the long coat he wore swirling slightly with the motion. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke. Your abilities, Scott, they're untamed, raw. You've barely scratched the surface of what you can do as a werewolf. Speed, strength, agility, those are just the beginning. Scott took a step closer, his curiosity piqued despite the tension in his frame. And what about Styles? He asked, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting his friend to materialize out of thin air. Orion's lips curled into a faint smile, amusement flickering across his sharp features. Ah, Styles, he said, a hint of pride in his tone. The vampire blood coursing through him gives him powers entirely different from yours. He's fast, blindingly so, and he has a mind for strategy that will serve us well. But he's as untrained as you are, which makes him just as dangerous to himself as to anyone else. As if summoned, a rustle in the trees announced Styles' arrival. He stepped into the clearing, his movements unnaturally silent despite the dry leaves beneath his boots. His pale skin seemed to catch the moonlight, and his sharp, dark eyes glinted with a restless energy. Did I miss something? He asked, his tone light but edged with curiosity as he scanned their faces. Orion's smile widened slightly, and he gestured for Styles to join them. Perfect timing, he said, his voice smooth as silk. We were just discussing your training. Styles arched an eyebrow, folding his arms over his chest. Training? He repeated, his tone skeptical. What, like a supernatural boot camp? Scott shot him a look, his exasperation barely concealed. It's not a joke, Styles, he said firmly. We're up against hunters, people who know how to take us down. If we don't learn to control our abilities, we're screwed. Styles' smirk faltered, and a more serious expression settled over his face. He nodded slowly, his gaze flickering to Orion. All right, he said, his voice quieter now. What do we do? Orion stepped forward, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his grip firm yet oddly comforting. First, he said, meeting their eyes in turn, you master the basics. Control. Discipline. Awareness. Your powers are tied to your emotions, and right now, those emotions are running wild. Until you can center yourselves, you're vulnerable. Scott's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening as he absorbed Orion's words. And after that? He asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Orion's enigmatic smile returned, and his eyes gleamed with something ancient and knowing. After that, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I'll show you what more you're capable of. What you can become when you embrace what you are. Scott and Styles exchanged a glance, their expressions mirroring a mix of determination and unease. Styles tilted his head slightly, his lips quirking into a faint, wry smile. Well, he said, his voice light but tinged with a hint of nervousness, this should be interesting. Orion chuckled softly, the sound low and almost predatory. Oh, it will be, he said, his tone laced with certainty. But first, you both need to survive the training. He stepped back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as they swept over the two young men. Come. Let's begin. As Orion led them deeper into the woods, the moonlight filtering through the canopy above, Scott and Styles followed, their movements hesitant but resolute. Each step carried them further into the unknown, their breaths steadying as they prepared to face the challenges ahead. 5 comments 0 vote. Meeting Kate. The streets of Beacon Hills were quiet, the late hour wrapping the town in an eerie stillness. Kate Argent's car cruised down the empty road, her sharp green eyes scanning the surroundings with predatory focus. Her return to Beacon Hills was not just a visit, it was a hunt, and the thought brought a small, satisfied smile to her lips. She reached for her radio, her fingers brushing against the weapon holstered at her hip, the weight a reassuring presence. As she neared a dimly lit intersection, a sudden, sharp thud jolted her car. The vehicle lurched violently to the right, the steering wheel fighting against her grip. Cursing under her breath, Kate slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. She shoved the door open and stepped out, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the flicker of irritation crossing her face. She crouched by the tire, inspecting it under the faint glow of the street lamp. A jagged metal spike was embedded in the rubber, glinting faintly. Kate's expression darkened, her jaw tightening as she rose to her feet, pulling her phone from her pocket. Her fingers moved quickly, dialing a number she knew by heart. Chris, she said when the line connected, her voice low and sharp. Someone's playing games. I'm in town, and I've been hit, tires blown out. Looks deliberate. I need backup. Her brother's calm, measured tone filtered through the phone, asking questions she didn't have the patience to answer. Kate's eyes darted to the shadows around her, her senses heightened as adrenaline began to course through her veins. No, I don't know who, she snapped. But I'm going to find out. She ended the call without waiting for his response, slipping the phone back into her pocket and unholstering her weapon in one fluid motion. Her movements were smooth, practiced, and purposeful as she began to scan the area, her footsteps quiet but confident. The tension in her body was palpable, every muscle coiled like a spring as she moved deeper into the town, leaving her disabled car behind. Dash dash dash. Meanwhile, Derek Hale was on the prowl, his sharp eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways for any sign of the Alpha. His dark leather jacket clung to his form, and his movements were swift but cautious. Each step he took was deliberate, his boots barely making a sound against the pavement. His senses were heightened, the faint scent of something unfamiliar drifting on the wind. As he turned a corner into a narrow alley, his instincts flared. He froze mid-step, his breath steady but shallow as he listened. There it was, a faint sound, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The soft scuff of boots against concrete. Someone was nearby. Before Derek could move, a sharp crack pierced the air, a gunshot, fast and precise. His reflexes kicked in, his body twisting to the side, but it wasn't fast enough. The bullet streaked toward him, cutting through the night like a deadly whisper. And then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared in front of him. Orion. Dash dash dash. Orion moved like a shadow-given form, his presence sudden and commanding. His coat billowed slightly with the force of his arrival, and in one impossibly quick motion, his hand shot out. The bullet struck his palm with a faint metallic ping, the force barely causing him to flinch. He stared at the small, flattened piece of metal in his hand, a flicker of amusement crossing his sharp features. Kate, still hidden in the shadows, lowered her gun slightly, her emerald eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Her breath hitched, and she took a cautious step back, her mind racing. Who the hell is that? She thought, her grip on the weapon tightening. Derek's eyes widened, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to reconcile what he'd just seen. Orion. He said, his voice low and uncertain. Orion turned his head slightly, a faint smirk playing at his lips. You're welcome, he said smoothly, flicking the flattened bullet to the ground with a casual air. His tone carried no urgency, as if catching bullets was a trivial matter. Kate stepped out of the shadows then, her weapon raised again but her stance cautious. Her green eyes burned with curiosity and suspicion as they locked onto Orion. Who are you? She demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. And why are you protecting a werewolf? Orion turned fully to face her, his movements unhurried and deliberate. His dark eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light, and his expression was unreadable, though there was a faint trace of amusement lingering there. You're asking the wrong questions, he said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of power. The better question is, why would I let you pull that trigger again? Kate's grip on her gun faltered for the briefest of moments, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She masked it quickly, her lips curling into a sly, dangerous smile. I don't scare that easily, she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Orion tilted his head slightly, his smirk widening. Oh, I know, he said, his tone almost patronizing. That's what makes this so much fun. Derek's gaze flickered between them, his body tense and ready to spring into action. But something in Orion's demeanor kept him rooted in place, a sense that the older man had everything under control. Kate took another step forward, her eyes narrowing. I don't know who you are, she said, her voice low and dangerous, but you've made a big mistake getting in my way. Orion chuckled softly, the sound low and rich, sending a chill down Derek's spine. That's where you're wrong, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The mistake was yours, Kate. You just don't realize it yet. A.N. Please folded hands search for I have different personalities and add it to your collections, thanks smile you. 10 comments 0 vote. Chris meets Orion. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and unyielding as Kate's green eyes darted between Orion and Derek. Her mind raced, trying to piece together this unexpected encounter. Before she could make another move, the sound of approaching footsteps and the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. Chris Argent appeared from the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder as his boots crunched against the pavement. His face was set in a grim mask, but his sharp eyes flicked from his sister to the unfamiliar man standing in front of her. The glow of the street lamp highlighted the silvery streaks in his hair and the faint crease of worry lines on his brow. Kate's posture eased slightly, her lips quirking in relief, though the dangerous edge in her stance remained. Finally, she muttered under her breath, lowering her gun just a fraction. Chris, however, froze mid-step as his eyes landed on Orion. His face, usually unreadable, betrayed a flicker of surprise. His gaze sharpened, narrowing as if he was trying to confirm what he was seeing. The man standing before him was unarmed, calm, and composed, his white hair gleaming under the faint light and his golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. White hair. Golden eyes. Chris murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He lowered his rifle slowly, his brow furrowing as realization struck. You're the one my wife picked up on the road the other day. And you're the teacher at the high school, aren't you? Orion. Orion's head tilted slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Guilty as charged, he said smoothly, his deep voice carrying an undertone of amusement. Though I imagine this is quite a leap from parent-teacher conferences. Chris's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable for a moment as he assessed Orion. His stance shifted subtly, his weight distributing evenly as if he was preparing for anything. What are you doing here? He asked, his tone calm but carrying an edge of suspicion. Orion met Chris's gaze evenly, his expression calm and unhurried. He spread his hands slightly, a gesture of openness that didn't quite match the sharp glint in his eyes. Just keeping the peace, he said, his voice smooth and measured. It seems your sister here was a bit eager to make an introduction. Kate bristled, her grip tightening on her gun. Don't act like you're innocent, she snapped, her tone sharp. What the hell are you? Because no human catches a bullet with their bare hand. Orion turned to face her fully, his movements as fluid as a predator's. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, they seemed to glow brighter. What I am, he said, his voice dropping to a softer, more dangerous tone, is someone you shouldn't test. Kate took a half step back, the corner of her lips twitching in irritation at the involuntary movement. She hated feeling outmatched, and this man, whoever he was, made her feel exactly that. Chris raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. Kate, stand down, he said, his eyes never leaving Orion. Kate hesitated, her gaze flickering between her brother and Orion before she reluctantly lowered her weapon, her movements sharp and precise. The set of her jaw and the tension in her shoulders betrayed her frustration, but she said nothing. Chris took a step closer to Orion, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man. You've been around, haven't you? He said carefully. Not just as a teacher. There's more to you than that. Orion's smile widened slightly, a flicker of something almost predatory flashing in his expression. Let's just say I have a vested interest in the balance of things, he said cryptically. And tonight, that balance almost tipped. Derek, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze was locked on Orion, a mix of wariness and curiosity in his eyes. You could have killed her, he said bluntly, his voice low but steady. Why didn't you? Orion glanced at Derek, his expression softening slightly, though his golden eyes retained their sharpness. Because killing rarely solves anything, he said simply. And because I'm not here to fight unnecessary battles. Chris crossed his arms, his stance shifting to one of cautious authority. If you're as involved as you seem to be, Orion, then you know this town doesn't take well to surprises, he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. If you're going to intervene, I need to know why. Orion's gaze met Chris's, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken understanding. Let's just say I'm here to help, Orion said finally, his voice calm but firm. And if you're smart, you'll let me. Chris's jaw tightened, his expression thoughtful as he considered Orion's words. After a long pause, he nodded once, his movements deliberate. For now, he said, his tone making it clear that his trust was conditional. But this isn't over. Kate opened her mouth to protest, but a sharp look from Chris silenced her. She huffed, shoving her gun into its holster with a frustrated motion. This town keeps getting weirder, she muttered under her breath, shooting a final glare at Orion before turning away. Orion watched her go, his expression unreadable but tinged with faint amusement. He turned back to Chris, inclining his head slightly. You won't regret this, he said, his tone light but carrying an edge of certainty. We'll see, Chris replied, his tone cool. His eyes flicked to Derek, lingering for a moment before he turned on his heel and followed his sister into the night. As the Argent siblings disappeared, Derek turned to Orion, his expression a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. You keep showing up at the right time, he said, his voice low. What's your angle? Orion's lips curled into a faint smile, his golden eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. Let's just say, he said, his tone smooth and enigmatic, I prefer to keep things quiet. For now, that's all you need to know. With that, Orion turned and walked away, his coat billowing slightly as he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Derek alone to process what had just transpired. A.N. Please folded hands search for I have different personalities and add it to your collections, thanks smile you. 10